Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 10. In Daniel 10, we have the beginning of the final vision in the book of Daniel. It will take us all the way from chapter 10 through chapter 12. In chapter 10, we learn of a great tribulation. This term, great tribulation, becomes very important in some eschatological discussions. We're going to look at this term in its context in Daniel chapter 10 and what it might mean for Daniel and for end times theology. We're also going to look at the vision itself, which is of a heavenly glorified man who appears apparently hovering over the Tigris River. The Tigris River was a very important river in the time of Seleucid Syria, and I believe that is no coincidence. Before we learn all the details of history that will come in Daniel chapter 11, we learn about Michael, an archangel, and we have a tiny window into angelic warfare as Michael is in a conflict with the Prince of Persia. We'll talk about what we learn from this little window into angelic warfare as we consider this important chapter in the book of Daniel. Today we are going to begin chapter 10. So we'll begin with verse 1, chapter 10, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of the Persians, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was called by his name Belteshazzar. And the word was reliable, and it concerned a great tribulation, and he understood the word, and he received understanding. Now, right off we notice that Daniel is being called in the third person again, talked about rather than Daniel himself. So we have a little interruption by a narrator, perhaps an editor. I think it's the same person who was introducing us to Daniel's writings at the beginning of chapter 7. Who was introducing us and then said, Daniel had written all this down, and here's what he wrote. And we have this same voice coming here at the beginning of chapter 10. And he talks about Daniel being called Belteshazzar. Now, we haven't had that name for Daniel since the time of Nebuchadnezzar being used in the book. But there are some strong connections between Daniel 10 and Daniel chapter 1, where he got the name Belteshazzar. So if you'll remember that when we watched the Bible Project overview, there were a lot of connections between the chapters, and the 2 chapters in the middle sort of connected, and then the 2 chapters on either side of that connected, and so on. And now we're almost to the outside connection, where this chapter connects all the way back to chapter 1 with some of the things that happen here. And this is going to introduce one of the longest visionary passages in Daniel. Through this vision, which will happen right after this opening, goes from chapters 10 and 11 and 12. So the last 3 chapters of Daniel are all one coherent visionary experience that Daniel experienced, the longest one of the book. And he mentions here that the word that Daniel had received was reliable, and it concerned a great tribulation. This short phrase, great tribulation, is notable. A lot of eschatological schemes build off of this term to say that there's a regular tribulation and then there's a great tribulation. Some people make very big distinctions between the degree of tribulation based on this phrase. But interestingly, this phrase only appears 3 times in the whole Bible. Here is one of them. The other 2 are in Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus is teaching about end times things. He says in Matthew 24:21, "For at that time there will be a great tribulation," or rather, not a great tribulation, but there will be great tribulation, "such as has not happened from the beginning of the world till now, nor ever will happen." And then in Revelation, we read in chapter 7, and this is where one of the 24 elders speaking or sitting in the throne room of the heavenly throne room addresses John, asks him to explain about the vision that he just saw. And John doesn't know. And he says to this elder, I said to him, my Lord, you know what's going on, who these people are. And he said to me, these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So most interpreters of these visions will say that there's a relationship between these three instances of the word great tribulation, that they're referring to the same thing. One way to interpret it is that Daniel, Matthew, and Revelation are all talking about exactly the same events. Another way to interpret it is that Jesus in his Olivet Discourse is talking about something similar to what Daniel was talking about. Daniel was talking about one great tribulation of a historic nature, and Jesus is saying when all of these things take place, there will be a great tribulation. He's alluding to Daniel without necessarily saying that Daniel and he are talking about the exact same sequence of events, but rather the same type of events, this great tribulation.
What would you call the flood? I mean, that to me is as bad a tribulation as, everybody in the world does. So,
yes, it's hard to top that. Hard to have a greater tribulation than the flood.
There you go.
I don't know, tribulation speaks to more than just a natural disaster to me. Like there's a lot of anguish and suffering and pain.
Right, for an extended period of time. Yeah. I think that you can see it both ways. I tend to think that this phrase, this has not happened ever before from the beginning of the world or ever happen again, might be rhetorical exaggeration to how severe it will be. It will be very severe. And you personally will never experience it before, and you won't experience it worse than that again. This is the worst you're going to experience tribulation, or the people who live at that time, it will be the worst thing they've ever lived through or ever could. So I think it could be pointing to that. Similar kind of phrasing was in Joel, when Joel talks about the locusts. And he apparently, in Joel chapter 1, is talking about a literal locust swarm, infestation. What's the word I'm looking for? Devastation from this locust swarm. And he says it's never happened before. Well, probably in the history of mankind, there had been a similar sort of locust plague in an area, but not for that generation. Nobody in that generation had ever experienced something that bad, and that isn't going to happen again in their generation again. It's a very rare but terrible thing. And I think that's kind of the point behind Jesus' words. This is going to be as bad as it will get for the people who live through it. It could not be worse for them to live through this thing, whatever it is.
No, we've got Jesus here who has perspective from the beginning of time to the end of time, as he stands there right then and he's saying it's the worst it will ever be. I kind of tend towards the other direction.
Okay. And then in Revelation, he talks about the people who have come out of a great tribulation. And we are looking at starting our walk through Revelation, and I'll definitely be coming back to this in chapter 7 when we talk about that again. What exactly does he mean, especially when he talks about these people having come out of a great tribulation? We'll unpack all of that. But I just wanted to point out this phrase. It has its inception here in Daniel. The first time we hear about a great tribulation in those words exactly are here in this introductory part of Daniel chapter 10. And so we will then start unpacking it. And so not to be missed, though, he's talking about this great tribulation, and then he's going to unpack what Daniel learns in chapter 10. So presumably, chapter 10 and 11, when he actually gets to some of the details in chapter 11, is about the Great Tribulation that he's just mentioned. And so that's an important interpretive factor, is that he's talking about what Daniel's talking about when he says Great Tribulation. And that won't become clear until chapter 11, which we will certainly not be able to start unpacking until next week at the earliest. So let's dive in with what Daniel then resumes in verse 2. So Daniel's words are in Daniel 10, verses 2 and 3. In those days, I, Daniel, I myself, notice how it's an emphasis on, this is now Daniel speaking, not the narrator, if you will, who was just introducing it, but this is Daniel. I myself was in mourning for 3 whole weeks. I had not eaten any choice food, and meat and wine did not enter my mouth, and I did not use any ointment until the end of the 3 whole weeks. And notice that this is another connecting all the way back to chapter 1. Because it was in chapter 1 when Daniel and the other 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to eat the delicacies of the king and only ate vegetables and didn't drink the wine. This is almost the exact same kind of thing. He wasn't fasting outright, but he was refusing himself the pleasures of food, if you will, those delicacies and the wine. He was bread and water for this period of time, in mourning for 3 whole weeks. Chapter 10, verse 4. Then on the 24th day of the first month, I myself was on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris. So time and place are very important, I believe, for the setting of this chapter. Now we have the 24th day of the first month. And also remember from the introductory first verse, this was the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. So in the big scheme of things, this puts us after Darius and into the reign of Cyrus. This is the very latest time that we have. So Daniel is clearly in his 90s by now, 3 years into the reign of Cyrus. And this is about the period of time when Zerubbabel and that first wave of Jews would just be getting around to go back to Jerusalem. So Daniel may be still pondering the 70 years and still pondering the exile and all that it means, even though some of the exiles have permission to go back now. But this is the 24th day of the first month.
Interestingly, during this 3 weeks of sorrow, the Passover would have been occurring.
That's why I think this is part of Daniel's context. Passover, presumably even in the ancient days, was a time for the Jews to mourn their absence from Jerusalem. Isn't it even a current tradition in Jewish households to say next year in Jerusalem?
Yep.
Right, because they always hope that they can go back and be in Jerusalem for Passover. And Daniel was not in Jerusalem for Passover, and until that year really hadn't had permission to go back to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. Now, some Jews were getting ready to go that way. Whether anybody had actually gotten back to Jerusalem by this time, I don't know. But I think this is part of his attitude and why he's mourning. I think it could very well be, because I don't think we can date it as precisely as your translation suggests. I think it's possible that his mourning began or began in anticipation of Passover, that was when he began this period of mourning, celebrating Passover within that period of mourning, and then just continuing as he was burdened by the absence from Jerusalem and the continuing exile of the people of Israel. Now, what about the place? He finds himself on the bank of the great river that is the Tigris. Now, even though the Tigris was not too far from Babylon, maybe 50 miles or so, that's still a big trip for a 90-year-old in that day and age, and not an easy trek to get to the Tigris River. I personally think that this was a visionary experience by the Tigris, just as it was by the Ulai River in chapter 8, when he had that vision. I think these rivers that he's next to, he's there in spirit, not in the body, in the flesh. I think the vision begins here, that he finds himself on the banks of the Tigris. Now, why would he be at the Tigris? Well, think about why he was at the Ulai. He was in front of Susa, which in Daniel's own day was a district capital, moderately important but not greatly important, and certainly didn't look like the visionary Susa in his vision, because that Susa that was built onto a canal that had been dug out from the Ulai to go intentionally through the city of Susa and in front of a citadel. That citadel didn't exist when Daniel was there. That whole description is of a future Susa when it's the capital of Persia. So he is having a vision in Daniel 8 of a city that doesn't exist yet, because it's not going to be built until the days of not even Cyrus, it's I think Darius, who has that city of Susa built the way it is in Daniel's vision. So he's seeing that future capital of Persia. One commentator said there was no apparent meaning or significance to being by the Tigris. I was kind of like, okay, well, that seems random to mention the Tigris River if it doesn't really have that meaning. So I was actually just doing some research into where is the Tigris? Does it flow near Babylon? How far does it go? Where is it? When I read an article that on the Tigris River was the first capital of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire that we've already seen is so important to these visions of Daniel because Antiochus was a Seleucid king. So his vision here is of a place that, again, is not going to be important until the Seleucid Empire is founded by, what's his name? I think I have it written down. Nicator. So Nicator, who is the first king of the Seleucid Empire after Alexander. This is post-Alexander, remember, because that Seleucid Empire didn't get founded until Alexander the Great died, and all the generals parceled out the territory, and Nicator parceled out this part called the Seleucid Empire in 305 BC. So I think that's why it's important, because the whole Seleucid kingdom is an important part of these visions that Daniel has had, at least in chapter 8. I would contend in chapter 7 already, and in chapter 8, and even in chapter 9, as I see it. So I think this is an important location for that future representation. And as we get into chapter 11, we'll see why it's continuing to be an important location. So that's why I think it's on the Tigris. Then verses 5 and 6 of chapter 10. I lifted up my eyes, and I saw, and there was a man, and he was dressed in linen, and his waist was girded with the gold of Uphaz. Now his body was like turquoise, and his face was like the appearance of lightning, and his eyes were like torches of fire, and his arms and his legs were like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words was like the sound of a multitude. So a dramatic figure, a celestial or heavenly figure of a man that Daniel sees. The descriptions are very redolent of Ezekiel's description of like the living creatures that he saw around the throne, and even the throne itself and what he can make out of the person on the throne. If you look at Ezekiel's vision, it's very vague about the person sitting on the throne, and I think that's by design, because that's God the Father, and you don't look directly at God the Father. So it describes the robe of the person on the throne, and it's that sort of thing, and lightning coming from the throne. But all of that seems to be very angelic, supernatural, heavenly. And so this is a heavenly figure, but still looks like a man. Apparently it doesn't look anything like those living creatures with the 4 different faces of Ezekiel. So it's similar to Ezekiel in that, in some ways, and different, and that this is just a figure of a man. I think it probably is meant to echo the Son of Man figure that we had from Daniel 7, but here is a man. Now, most commentators I've looked at suggest that this man, this heavenly figure, is the one who then talks to Daniel. I don't think so. I'm going to say why. Because, like I mentioned earlier, this vision continues through chapters 11 and chapter 12. And in chapter 12, there's another description of the location of the man and the scene as it is unfolding. And so I'd like to jump to Daniel 12, verses 5 and 6 for that extra context. In those verses we read this: "Then I looked, I myself, Daniel, and look, there were two others standing, one on this bank of the stream and one on the other. And then he said to the man who was clothed in linen, who was above the water of the stream, how long until the end of the wonders?" Now we'll get to the detail of that question and all and when we get to chapter 12, but I just want to mention, this is what Daniel says he's seeing. This figure in linen, which is clearly the heavenly man, is above the waters of the Tigris, floating there apparently, hovering there above the waters, in between the two banks. I think is an interesting symbolism that he's not on either side of that divide. But there's a figure with Daniel on one side, and there's a figure on the other side, and then there's the one in the middle that is the heavenly one. And when he says, "Then he said to the man who was clothed in linen," he's obviously talking about one of the two men. I think the figure that's next to him probably, Daniel and this other figure are on one side of the bank. There's one guy on the other side, and then the figure in the middle. And the one next to Daniel talks to the figure in the middle and asks a question. I think this description is how it is unfolding. I think there is this man in the middle, heavenly man in the middle, and then there's someone else with Daniel who is in proximity to Daniel and talking to him. Now, it's not clear that that's the case, and you could argue that I'm off base with how this is reading, and that's fine. That may be the case. But this is how I read it. Let's read the next thing, verses 7 and 8. "And I saw, Daniel, alone the vision, and the people who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled in order to hide themselves. And I myself, Daniel, alone saw this great vision. And as a result, no strength was left in me, and my complexion grew deathly pale, and I did not retain my strength." So he is alone having this vision. I think this is an interesting parallel with Paul, when he was Saul on the road to Damascus, because he was there with a couple of others, but they didn't experience the voice of Jesus talking to them. It was only Paul who did. So it was a very interesting parallel, I think, between this revelation to Daniel and the revelation of Jesus to Saul. But this is one point that some people point out why Daniel fails to be the Messiah figure, why he doesn't rise to that level, is because when he experiences these things, he generally gets pale and falls down and is overwhelmed by it. He doesn't do anything wrong morally, but he's just overwhelmed by this truth and disturbed by it, as we read sometimes. All right, verse 9. "I heard the sound of his words." Presumably that's the figure hovering above the Tigris who's speaking. "When I heard the sound of his words, I myself began falling into a trance on my face, with my face to the ground." So his words affect him as well, and he hears the words and just falls down. First, I guess he fell to his knees, and now he falls on his face because of these words that he hears. And now it's the next part, verses 10 and 11, that I don't think is the man in the middle of the Tigris. So verses 10 and 11. "And look, a hand touched me, and it roused me to my knees and the palms of my hands. And he said to me, 'Daniel, a man beloved, pay attention to the words that I am speaking to you, and stand upright where you are, for I have now been sent to you.' And while he was speaking with me this word, I stood up trembling." So there's a couple of reasons I think this is not the man over the river. And one is, we read later that there is somebody else with Daniel on his side of the river. Two, the words of this man don't put Daniel face flat. They raise him up. He says, "Stand up and talk with me." Also, apparently the words do not sound like a multitude, but just this man talking to him. So I think that this figure is not the same as the figure that's in the middle of the river, hovering above the middle of the river. But this is why it's debatable, because some people think that this description is of that man talking to Daniel. And I can see that because there's nothing that says it's otherwise in the immediate context. In verse 12, and he said to me, you must not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I myself have come because of your words. So this sounds like Gabriel. Now, chapter 10 doesn't actually identify him as Gabriel, but it's the same kind of thing. Daniel is seeking for wisdom, and God sends an angelic interpreter to come and explain things to Daniel. It was so in chapter 7. Actually, one of the angelic figures in the vision is talking to Daniel in chapter 7. But in chapter 8, it's Gabriel. And in chapter 9, it's Gabriel. And I think here in chapter 10, it's Gabriel. And that's why, again, I don't think in the previous two instances where Gabriel shows up, he does not fit the description of the man between the two rivers or between the two banks. He fits more of a normal man. He looks like a man who's coming to talk to him. And so I think this is Gabriel again talking to Daniel to explain what's going on, even though he doesn't get named in chapter 10. But this may be one of the key phrases to take away from Daniel chapter 10. Daniel has been mourning and fasting of sorts for 3 weeks. But his words were heard immediately. It wasn't like God was slow to hear. He heard Daniel's words as soon as he cried out to him. Now we'll learn shortly why Gabriel, I'm going to call him Gabriel, it may not be Gabriel, it doesn't give a name, but I'm going to use Gabriel just for convenience sake. Why Gabriel didn't show up right away, we're going to learn that in the next verse. But his words were heard. God heard and responded to Daniel's words immediately. I think that's one of the main takeaways from this, is that when we pray, God hears us. And we may not see a response immediately. And we may not know or that things are happening. But in the spiritual world, things are happening because of our words. Our prayers are heard. God responds to our prayers. Now in verse 13, we read why Gabriel didn't show up right away. He says in verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia stood before me for 21 days. And look, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to assist me, and I left him there beside the king of the Persians. So Gabriel started out on this trip, but wasn't able to arrive because he was opposed by this Prince of Persia. This is a cryptic passage because it's one of the only places we read of this kind of activity in the spiritual realm. But it tells us a few things. One, it tells us that angels are not omnipresent. Angels have to go somewhere. They are sent from a place to a place. God sends them. They are not everywhere all the time. God is, not angels. They are located in time and space, apparently, and he sends them on their errands. Secondly, they're opposed. There are good and bad, or there are angelic figures that do not support God's program. Here, this Prince of Persia. This phrase, the prince, or word the prince, is sometimes used of angelic beings. It seems it's used of Michael, one of the chief princes, it calls him. We know Michael is the angel, but he is also called a prince. So the Prince of Persia, the Prince of Javan, which is another name, will come in a little bit in this chapter, Javan being Greece. And then we have the Prince apparently of Israel, or at least of the Jews, because we read later of the Prince of your people, the Jews. So we have this connection. And this ties us all the way back to what we would call the divine council worldview, or that Deuteronomy 32 worldview, that God assigned supernatural beings to the nations. We also have the suggestion of a hierarchy, though, with Michael being the chief princes. So here's another adjective. He's a prince, but then there are also chief princes. So there's some sort of hierarchy where there are chief princes and then there are princes under them. And so there is the hint of a hierarchy. Now, some Jewish idea people back in the Second Temple period, in the ancient times, and all the way up to modern times, people are hypothesizing about what does this hierarchy look like? How many are there chief princes? How many princes? How many of this or that? Who are they over? How many levels of hierarchy are there? There's all kinds of speculation out there, dating all the way back to the time of Christ and before, for how these angels relate to each other. And we have just this little tiny bit to go on. So all of it is speculation. But I think some people ask, how is it that Satan would still oppose God and think that he could win? Why would he bother with fighting Yahweh when Yahweh is obviously omnipotent? Well, maybe it's situations like this. The Prince of Persia was able to oppose Gabriel, or whatever angelic figure is speaking to Daniel, for a while. Not forever, not until Michael showed up to help. So this might give them some sense of hope that maybe if we could muster enough forces, we could oppose them indefinitely or defeat them. Because angels aren't omnipotent and angels aren't omnipresent. And so they might be able to defeat the angels. I don't think they will ever, obviously, defeat Yahweh. But I think this is why they think they can at least win a battle. Maybe they know they can't win the war, but they might win a battle. And so they try. Anyway, that's a lot of speculation out of this one little verse, but it is one of those verses that's so tantalizing with information. Gabriel says in verse 14, I have come to instruct you about what will happen to your people in the future, for there is a further vision here for the future. Daniel says, while he was speaking with me according to these words, I turned my face to the ground and I was speechless. Obviously, this is pretty dramatic. Then verses 16 and 17, then look, there was one in the form of a human. He touched my lips, and I opened my mouth, and I spoke, and I said to the one standing before me, my Lord, because of the vision, my anxieties fell upon me, and I have not retained my strength. So how am I, a servant of my Lord, to speak with you, my Lord, and I just now have no strength in me? I don't know all of the implications here, but the idea of touching his lips and opening his mouth reminds me of the vision in Isaiah, where Isaiah said, he's given a commission to preach for Yahweh, but he says, I'm a man of unclean lips. And then an angelic figure in that vision touches his lips with a coal. I guess Daniel didn't have to get touched with a coal. But he does touch his lips, which sort of like opens them to speak to this man. But he says, this is just overwhelming to me. I'm so worried, anxious about what I'm seeing. I don't even know what to say. But he is strengthened again with the touch of the angelic figure in verses 18 and 19. He touched me, the one in the form of a human, and he strengthened me. And he said, you must not fear, O beloved man. Peace be to you, be strong and be courageous. And when he spoke with me, I was strengthened, and I said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Then in verse 20, then he asked, do you know why I have come to you? And now I will return to fight the Prince of Persia, and I myself am going, and look, the Prince of Javan will come. So he's got to go back and fight that prince again. There's something going on there, and he's talking about the Prince of Javan, which we know is Greece. The implication, I think, is that the fall of Persia to Greece is partly a spiritual battle. And that Gabriel here, or whatever figure this is part of that battle. And that is going to be unfolding as soon as he gets back to help Michael again to defeat the prince of the Persians. Just going to finish this out. There's only one more verse in this chapter, chapter 10, verse 21. However, I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth, and there is not one who contends with me against these beings except Michael, your prince. So here's that reference that Michael is your prince. Presumably that means the prince of the Jews. And so Michael, the prince of the Jews, and this Gabriel, the messenger, are going to team up against the Prince of Persia. And eventually the Prince of Javan is going to come on their side to fight against the Prince of Persia. And of course, he will win through the function of Alexander the Great. And just want to wrap up with the Book of Truth, a comment there. This is apparently God's direction, his will for what will happen. And what God has already predetermined is going to happen, he has written in the Book of Truth. And what is written in that book cannot be changed. And so Gabriel says, what is written in that book, I am going to explain to you here. These are the things which will definitely happen. And he's going to unfold that. When I read that, as I'm studying through Daniel, I'm thinking about the scroll that's in the hand of God, in which the Lamb of God takes in Revelation chapter 5 to open the seals. I think that is also a very apt description of what could be written on that scroll, the Book of Truth, the things that God is going to unfold among us. And so the Lamb is worthy of breaking those seals and revealing what is written in that Book of Truth. All right, so that's all we get. Chapter 11 is all of the explanation for what is in that Book of Truth. Thank you for taking time to study the book of Daniel with me. I hope you'll take a moment and add a comment under the YouTube video, or hop over to Facebook and find the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group and join our discussion there. And you can always email me directly at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net. I hope you'll find this lesson to be a blessing to you, and that you'll join us again as we uncover the treasures in the